So gaan agter met 'n kwessie wat dreig om die ekonomie land te lê en dit is die konstruksiemafia. Hierdie groeperings dring gewelddadig aan op betaling vir bouprojekte al doen hulle geen werk nie. Die minister van openbare werke en infrastruktuur, Dean Macpherson, is hier by my in die ateljee om hieroor te praat. Dean, so let's start with this issue of the construction mafia. You've said that you want to turn South Africa into a construction site. Is there an indication that these groupings that we refer to as the construction mafia, that they've infiltrated your department?
Well, I cannot rule out anything because these are very sophisticated individuals. They are well-resourced, well-armed, and they are no doubt working with individuals either within our department or who have access to information to our department. The reality is that what they do is they bring misery to communities by stopping infrastructure projects. They escalate the cost of infrastructure projects, and they severely jeopardize the involvement of the private sector in building South Africa and all the work that we want to do. So we've taken a very strong and principled stance to say there's no negotiations, there's no discussions. The only discussion we're going to have is over prison sentences for them, because that's where they belong. They don't belong around our boardroom tables having these discussions, and we're going to have to be very, very firm. We've got the commitment of the President. Now we need to work together as a government, in the Government of National Unity, to execute that and to make sure that we take back our construction sites and get services and infrastructure back into communities.
But Dean, what these mafias do, what does it do to the economy?
Well, what it does is it increases the costs. So if we have an infrastructure project and it gets delayed, there are penalties for that. There's penalties for other subcontractors. The cost of capital increases because the project is not being completed. But more importantly and more scarily, what it does is it scares away foreign and domestic investors into our infrastructure projects. Because who wants to put their money into a project that may actually never take off or may be delayed? And these are not people who are looking to better the community or to find ways of helping out. They simply want cash. That's called extortion, and that is illegal in South Africa.
I would assume that it's perhaps impossible for you to tackle this problem alone. Are you working closely with the police?
It's got to be an all-of-society approach. Our department, police, defence, presidency, all departments and communities. And we've seen that there actually can be wins in this space. The President, correctly so, deployed the SANDF to protect power stations when they were under attack and being sabotaged. That doesn't happen anymore. So if we all agree that these infrastructure projects are projects of the state and people are trying to interfere in them, they should be treated as enemies of the state. Now, I know that sounds tough, but that's the kind of tough talking and tough actions that we need to take if we want to get our infrastructure build back on track so that we can move the needle on economic growth and, more importantly, job creation.
But on this tough talk, we've perhaps seen a bit of pushback, especially in a province like KwaZulu-Natal. The MEC for Infrastructure and Public Works, Martin Meyer, is quoted as saying that he's found a bullet in his car. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I spoke to the MEC and I've pledged my absolute support to him. I've also spoken to the Premier, Tami Ntuli, and he's been in unison with us on this issue. Because if we don't arrest it now, then our country becomes captive to people who have the biggest weapons and the largest ammunition stock. And we can't run a country like that. We've got to take back these sites because next week I'm going with the President to China. We're going to be selling South African projects. We're going to be looking for new capital. And our lives are going to be so much harder if we have crooks and gangsters back at home who are holding up our projects. So I really think that we are on the right track. In September sometime, we'll be convening a national summit between the police, between us, between defence and big construction companies so that we can finally speak with one voice and have one plan of action to fight back against the mafia.
Dean, tell me more about this trip to China and the possibility of finance. From certain sectors, there's been concern regarding foreign investment. Is that not something that the President has perhaps expressed to you?
Well, I think what the President has been clear on is that we need to get more private sector capital into our public sector build. We can't do it alone. And what we are currently achieving with the small budgets that we have is for every R1 we invest, we're able to leverage that 5 times in the private sector. I think we can do more. We actually receive very little investment out of Asian development banks and infrastructure institutions. So I'm very excited to go and meet with them, present our infrastructure plan and our construction book, and say this is the opportunities for you to invest in our country, to invest in our infrastructure projects. Because when we do them, we do them actually very well. And I'm convinced that on that state visit, we're going to be able to put the best foot forward in the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure. We're going to be able to showcase South Africa as an investment opportunity. We're going to be able to take the sentiment that is behind the government of national unity into the heart of Asia, into one of the world's largest economies, and say we're open for business, we're ready to get things done, we'll do everything that we can to protect your investment. Now's the opportunity to come and join us.
But when we look at a country like China, is there not concern about strings being attached?
Look, we always have to make sure that we guard the national interest. And so, we'll always be very frank and upfront about what the terms and conditions are. But if I look at the work that some of the Asian development banks are doing, it's quite incredible. And they're doing it in Australia, in the United States, all over Europe. So I think that as long as the terms and conditions are very clear, we understand what they are, they understand what they are, I think that we're going to be able to find the important funding that we need. Because the reality is, we've got to double the amount of funding that we have in infrastructure projects at the moment if we want to reach our goal of 30% of fixed gross capital formation in our country. We're only halfway there at the moment. So we've got a lot of work to get that up. We need all the money that we can, all the help that we can, and I'm convinced that we're going to be able to find some of that in Asia next week.
Dean, give us an idea of the maintenance backlog when we look at government-owned buildings like schools, hospitals and courts.
So I think the problem that we've found since I've come into office is that government has a very indifferent infrastructure plan across the 3 spheres of government. We've said, in the proposal that we're putting on the table, is that we need a single point of entry for all government-led infrastructure development in this country. And there's a fabulous organization called Infrastructure South Africa, got some of the smartest people you could ever meet, who are able to design, package, and find private sector capital to invest in that. And I think that if we have a more holistic approach in infrastructure, we'll be able to not only build what we need, but more importantly, maintain what we have. And that is where the real crisis exists. But there is a crisis in local government. They find it difficult for many reasons, including capacity, in terms of attracting private sector funding, to be able to put bulk infrastructure in the ground, your water pipes, transmission, so on. And if we can't get that right, it makes it very difficult for us to put the big projects on top of that. So we want to work together. We're one government, and we want to work with them, and we're going to be hopefully presenting in the next couple of months a new infrastructure plan to South Africa that speaks to the various strands that make up infrastructure, from schools, hospitals, clinics, to roads, to rail, to ports, and big civil projects. And I think that if we get that right, we can really start to hit our targets.
Is it true that government doesn't know how many buildings it owns?
That is true, and it is an unfortunate reality that government has never been able to get a credible asset register. And we must, because for 2 reasons. Well, we must know what we own, so we know what we can do with that. But number 2, we've got to make sure that the value price to those assets is correct. Because what I want to do is I want to start leveraging government assets into the private sector. We need to ask ourselves, do we need this building? Do we need that piece of land? So we need to be able to do 2 things at once. We're not going to wait until the register is correct before we start working with other governments. I've recently was with the Mayor of Tshwane, and we've set up now a monthly meeting of how we can use our buildings to assist. Next week, I'll be going to meet with the Mayor of eThekwini, and I'm having the same conversations to say that the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure needs to be of good use and good value to you. Let's make our public assets be used for public good, because right now they're not being used in the correct way, in my view.
Minister, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.